There's a sentence people say at retirement parties, and it sounds like a promise. Now we'll finally have time together. Everyone smiles when they hear it. Nobody argues with it. And for a great many couples, that sentence turns out to be the opening line of the hardest 2 years of their marriage. Not because the love ran out, not because anybody did anything wrong, but because of something almost nobody sees coming, and it isn't about the marriage at all. Here's the part that took me too long to understand. You did not have a marriage for the last 40 years. You had a marriage and a job, and the job was holding up far more of that marriage than either of you ever realized. It's Bill. 35 years of work behind me, retired long enough to have made most of the mistakes I talk about on this channel, and I made this one with both feet. This is where we tell the truth about life after the gold watch, the stuff the retirement seminars leave out. They'll spend an afternoon on your withdrawal rate, not 1 minute on the person who will be standing in the kitchen when you get home from that seminar. So here's what we're doing today. 7 things that happen to a marriage when the work stops, what the research says about each one, and the ordinary, unglamorous ways couples get through them, in your home, your time, and your sense of who you each are. Because if you're already retired and something feels off that you can't name, or you're a year out and quietly nervous about it in a way you haven't said out loud to anybody, there's a reason for that, and it's a better reason than the one you're afraid of. This isn't a video about romance or date nights. This is about something structural. What actually holds a long marriage up? What retirement removes and how you put it back? And if you stay to the end, you'll hear the one finding that separates the couples who come out of this closer from the ones who don't, and it is not what most people would guess. Before we start, one small free favor. If this is the kind of honesty you want more of, take a second and subscribe. It costs you nothing and it puts this in front of somebody who needs it. Let's begin. Number 1. You're not gaining time together, you're losing what made time together feel good. Do the arithmetic nobody does. 40 hours of work, plus the commute, plus getting ready, plus the decompression on the couch when you got home and weren't really available to anybody yet. Call it 50 hours a week that were structurally, automatically not together. That wasn't a choice either of you made. It was scaffolding. It was just there holding the shape of your week, and you never had to think about it. And then one Friday it comes down all at once. Here's the thing though, those 50 hours weren't empty. They were doing something. They were manufacturing the thing that made the evenings good, which is that you had been apart. You had something to come home from. There was news. There was a person walking through a door. The psychologist Sarah Yogev spent decades counseling couples through exactly this transition. And the earlier edition of her book on it carried a subtitle that says more than most whole chapters. For better or for worse, but not for lunch. That line gets a laugh, and then about 8 months into retirement, it stops being funny. Because the problem was never that you don't like each other. The problem is that closeness needs contrast, and you just deleted all of it in a single day. Think about 2 couples who retire the same spring. The first pair are thrilled, and they do everything together from day one: groceries, walks, appointments, television, all of it joined at the hip. And by autumn, they have run out of things to say, and neither of them will admit it. The second pair sit down in the first month and deliberately build separateness back in on purpose. 2 mornings a week where they don't see each other, and they feel slightly ridiculous doing it. 6 months later, one couple is bored and the other is fine. Same love, different architecture. So how do you practice this? First, count your old apart hours honestly, and then put a fraction of them back on the calendar as real, scheduled, unapologetic separateness. Second, protect the coming home. If nobody ever leaves, nobody ever arrives, and arriving is where the affection actually lives. And finally, when you feel that flat, restless irritation with a person you genuinely love, name it correctly. That is not the marriage failing. That is the contrast missing. You did not get more time together. You got less time apart. Those are not the same gift. Number 2. This is a known failure point, and the numbers are not subtle. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not in the business of frightening anybody, and I'm certainly not telling you your marriage is in trouble. But I'd be lying to you if I skipped this. 2 sociologists at Bowling Green State University, Susan Brown and I-Fen Lin, published a study in 2012 that named something the rest of us hadn't noticed yet. They called it gray divorce. What they found was that between 1990 and 2010, the divorce rate among American adults aged 50 and over roughly doubled. And here's the part that ought to stop you. That was happening while the overall national divorce rate was going down. Younger couples were splitting less. Older couples were splitting more. By 2010, more than a quarter of all divorces in the country involved somebody over 50. And of all the age groups you could look at, the one over 65 is the only one where the rate has kept climbing. In other words, this isn't a rare tragedy that happens to other people. It is the single most predictable pressure point in a long marriage, and it clusters right around the years we're talking about. But here's what I want you to take from that, and it's the opposite of despair. A pattern that clustered is a pattern with causes. Nobody's marriage of 35 years quietly evaporates for no reason at a statistically popular moment. Something specific is happening in these years, and the rest of this video is a list of the specific things. Have you ever noticed that the couples who struggle most are almost never the ones who saw it coming? That's the whole point. This is a structural problem that people experience as a personal failing, and then they don't talk about it because who wants to say out loud that they're not enjoying the thing they saved 30 years for? So how do you use this? First, take it off the personal shelf and put it on the structural shelf. What's happening to you is a known transition, not a verdict on your marriage. Second, say one honest sentence out loud to your spouse in the first year. Something like, "This is harder than I expected." Is it harder than you expected? And finally, know that the couples who report the highest marital satisfaction of their whole lives are also retired couples. They're just the ones on the other side of this passage. The statistic isn't a prophecy, it's a map of where the road gets rough. Number 3, the house was never neutral territory. Here's one almost nobody warns you about, and it causes more quiet damage than anything else on this list. For 30 years, somebody has been running that house. The rhythms of it, the systems, the order of the cupboards, when the laundry happens, which grocery store on which day, the whole invisible operating system of a home. And it worked. And then somebody who has been away from that house for 50 hours a week arrives permanently and, with the very best intentions in the world, starts improving it. In Japan, they gave this a name in 1991. A physician named Nobuo Kurokawa was seeing a stream of women in late middle age turning up with the same cluster of symptoms: rashes, ulcers, high blood pressure, depression, and what they had in common wasn't a virus. It was a husband who had just retired. He called it retired husband syndrome, and it entered the medical literature there. Now, I want to be careful with that because it's a Japanese clinical observation from a particular culture and a particular generation. And I'm not going to pretend it maps perfectly onto your house. But I've watched enough American marriages to tell you the mechanism travels just fine. And the numbers back up the underlying imbalance. Studies that have followed couples into retirement find that men do take on meaningfully more of the housework once they stop working. In one long study, their share went from about a fifth of the total to nearly 2/5, which is a real change and worth saying. But the same research found the wives were still doing around 60% of it and still putting in roughly 2 more hours a day. So the gap narrows, it does not close. And that's before we talk about the supervising, which is its own category. Reorganizing a kitchen that ran perfectly well for 3 decades, coming along on errands nobody asked to have accompanied, offering a better route to a store she has driven to 900 times. Here's the thing, that is almost never about control. That's a person who spent 40 years being competent at something, suddenly standing in a house where the only available job has already been taken. It's an identity looking for somewhere to live, and it lands on the nearest available system. And before I go further, I want to say the obvious thing because the research on this leans heavily on one arrangement, and your house may not look like that at all. Sometimes she retires first. Sometimes she's the one who spent 40 years away from the house and comes home to a husband who has run it beautifully without her and does not need a supervisor either. Sometimes there's no husband or no wife in the picture at all, and it's 2 men or 2 women working out exactly the same problem. The gender in the studies is a description of one generation's arrangement, not a law of nature. What travels across every version of it is the actual mechanism, which has nothing to do with men or women. Somebody had a domain, somebody else lost one. And a person who has lost a domain will unconsciously go looking for another. And the most available one in the world is the household that somebody they love has already spent decades perfecting. So how do you handle this? First, whoever is newly home should ask one question before improving anything. Is this actually broken, or am I just looking for something to run? Second, if you want a domain, take a whole one and own it end to end. The garden, the cars, the finances, all of it. Yours, unsupervised. Divide territory, don't co-manage it, because co-managing a task somebody already mastered is just supervision with extra steps. And finally, the person who has been running that house for 30 years is allowed to say, kindly and out loud, that she doesn't need help. She needs him to have his own thing. That is not a rejection. It's a request for a partner rather than a supervisor. Number 4, retiring at different times is its own separate crisis. Have you ever noticed how nobody plans this part? One of you goes first. That's normal, that's most couples, and it's almost never discussed as a decision at all. But researchers who study retirement transitions have found that the couples who report the sharpest drop in satisfaction are often exactly these, the mismatched ones, where one has stopped and one hasn't. And the reasons are more interesting than you'd think. The one who's still working comes home tired to somebody who has had a full and leisurely day and is ready to talk. The one who's retired feels a strange, low-grade guilt about the whole arrangement and starts overperforming usefulness to justify himself. Decisions that used to be shared start drifting to whoever has more hours to think about them. And power in a marriage follows attention. The research on this is fairly blunt about it. Retirement transitions tend to undermine satisfaction when they shift one partner's influence over the others. And it's often sharpest in couples who had traditional arrangements where the sequence runs against the roles they've lived by for decades. But here's the part that should encourage you. That same body of research finds the dip is a transition effect, not a permanent state. Couples in the thick of the changeover fight more and report less satisfaction. Couples who are both settled on the other side of it report some of the highest marital happiness and the fewest conflicts of their entire lives. Think of two couples in the mismatch. In the first, nobody names it, and the working spouse quietly starts resenting the leisure, and the retired spouse quietly starts resenting the resentment, and neither says a word for 2 years. In the second, they name it in the first month. The retired one keeps the household running deliberately so the working one comes home to a life instead of a list. And they agree out loud that this arrangement is temporary and lopsided, and that's fine. Same mismatch, completely different marriage. So how do you get through the gap? First, treat the mismatch as a defined phase with a name, not as the new normal. Second, protect the working spouse's evenings the way you'd protect a guest, because they are still living the old life and are the more tired person in the house. And finally, delay the big joint decisions, the move, the boat, the renovation, until you're both on the same side of the line. Decisions made across that gap tend to be made by whoever had the most free hours to think about them. And that is not the same thing as agreement. Number 5, when one of you loses an identity, both of you carry it. We talked on this channel about what happens when a title disappears and how a person can spend a year not knowing how to answer the question, what do you do? But there's a second half of that story that I skipped, and it deserves its own place on this list because identity loss is never a solo event in a marriage. It gets carried by two people. Watch what actually happens. One of you loses the structure, the status, the sense of being needed by a room full of people who relied on you. And that need doesn't evaporate, it relocates. It goes looking for the nearest place where somebody might depend on you. And the nearest place almost always is your spouse. So a person who was quietly independent for 35 years is suddenly the entire audience for another adult's need to be useful. And they feel it as pressure, and they can't say why, because on paper nothing bad is happening. Their husband is being attentive, their wife is being helpful. What's to complain about? It's a heavy thing to be somebody's only remaining job. In other words, when one partner's world contracts to the size of a house, The other partner becomes the whole world. And no marriage was built to carry that load, no matter how good it is. Picture two men, both retired a year, both a little lost. The first one has made his wife into his social life, his purpose, his calendar, and his audience. And he'd be genuinely hurt to hear it described that way, because he loves her and it feels like devotion. The second one has a Tuesday, a workshop, a committee, a class, a friend he owes a phone call. He comes to his wife with a life in his hands instead of a vacancy. The second man is easier to be married to, and it isn't because he loves her less. And I want to name the trap in the first man's situation because it's a cruel one, and it's easy to fall into with the best motives in the world. The more he leans on her, the more she pulls back, quietly, in ways she'd never admit and might not even notice. And the more she pulls back, the lonelier he gets, and the harder he leans. That's not a marriage going bad. That's a feedback loop. And feedback loops don't need anybody to be at fault to keep running. They just need nobody to interrupt them. The interruption, almost always, is one person building something outside the house, not as an escape from the marriage, as a supply line into it. So how do you protect each other here? First, both of you should be able to name 3 places you are expected, and they can't all be each other. Second, if you're the one carrying somebody's whole world right now, say so gently and early before it turns into the kind of resentment that gets expressed in tone instead of words. And finally, understand that building an outside life is not time taken from your marriage. It's the thing you'll bring back to it. A person with somewhere to go is a person worth waiting for. Number 6, you will need separate lives in order to have a shared one. Let me tell you about a couple. I'll call them Hector and Delia, and they'd be embarrassed to be in a video, but their story is the most useful one I know. Hector drove a delivery route for 31 years, up before 5, home by 4, and he was good at it and proud of it in the specific way men of his generation were proud of showing up. Delia raised 3 children in that house and then worked part-time at a school office, and more to the point, she ran everything. The house had a system, and the system was hers, and it worked so well that nobody, including Hector, had ever had to notice it existed. He retired on a Friday in March, and Hector was not a lazy man, and he was not a controlling man. He was a man who had been useful every single day for 31 years and suddenly wasn't. So he started helping. He reorganized the pantry because the way the cans were arranged didn't make sense to him. He started coming along on errands, and then driving on errands, and then commenting on the route. He was home when she got back from the school office, waiting, with the specific eagerness of a person who has been alone in a house all day and has been saving up conversation. And Delia, who loved him, started taking the long way home. She'd sit in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going in. She began finding reasons to run one more errand. She never said a word about it, and she'd have been horrified to hear it out loud. But the truth was that a woman who had been happily married for 34 years was rationing her own house. And that quiet went on for almost a year. Here's the moment it turned, and I love this part because there's no big argument in it. Her sister asked her casually over the phone how retirement was going, and Delia heard herself say, out loud before she could stop it, "I feel like I'm being followed." And then she cried because she hadn't known that's what she thought until she heard it. Now, most people would guess the next scene is a fight. It wasn't. What Delia did 3 days later was ask Hector to help with something specific. Her nephew's church needed somebody to organize the food drive, and it was a real job with real problems and 40 people who'd need telling what to do. And she asked him whether he'd take it. Not to get rid of him. She'd tell you flatly that's not what it was. But because she understood something before he did, which was that he didn't need less of her, he needed more of everything else. He took it. And he was, by all accounts, magnificent at it and completely insufferable about it for the first 2 months, which she says she enjoyed enormously. And here's the thing that changed at home. He came back from those Tuesdays with something in his hands. There was news. There was a person walking through a door. Delia says the marriage didn't get repaired exactly because it was never actually broken. It got its shape back, so don't hear this as a story about a difficult husband, because it isn't. And Hector would tell you the same thing. Hear it as a question about architecture. If one of you is currently the other's entire world, that's not romance. That's a load-bearing wall doing a job it was never designed for. Number 7, what predicts survival isn't compatibility, it's repair. And this is where it all comes together, because there's one more finding, and it reframes everything I've just told you. For decades, the psychologist John Gottman studied married couples in enormous detail, watching how they actually argued, and he became able to predict, with startling accuracy, which couples would still be together years later. And the thing that predicted it was not what anybody assumed. It wasn't shared interests. It wasn't how much they had in common, or how well matched they were, or even how often they fought. What predicted survival was a ratio. In stable marriages, during conflict, there were at least 5 positive interactions for every negative one. Outside of conflict, the successful couples ran much higher still. And a positive interaction wasn't a grand gesture. It was a small joke that broke the tension. A hand on a shoulder passing behind a chair. Actually listening when somebody was complaining about something small. Gottman's blunt way of putting it is that the bad is more powerful than the good, which is why it takes several of one to hold off the other. Now hold that next to everything else on this list. Retirement doesn't hand you a different spouse. It hands you many more hours, and more hours means more chances for the small negatives. The eye roll, the sharp tone, the correction that didn't need saying. The arithmetic gets harder purely because the volume goes up. And this is either terrible news or the best news in this video, depending on which way you look at it. It's the best news, and here's why. A ratio is a thing you can move. You cannot make yourself more compatible at 68. That's settled. But you can absolutely add small positives, and you can absolutely subtract small negatives. And those are ordinary acts available to anyone on any Tuesday. In other words, you are not trying to have fewer disagreements. Couples who never disagree aren't close. They're careful. You're trying to keep the repairs outrunning the damage. That's the whole job. And there's something quietly hopeful buried in that, which is that the ratio doesn't care how old you are. Compatibility is a thing you either lucked into decades ago or didn't. Repair is a skill, and skills are learnable at any age, which means a couple who have been getting this wrong for 30 years can start getting it right this month. I've watched it happen. Not dramatically. Nobody has a breakthrough. One person just starts saying thank you out loud for things that used to go unremarked, and the other person, who has been braced for a long time, slowly stops bracing. It takes a few months and it doesn't look like anything from the outside. So how do you live it? First, get concrete about the small positives, because they're the ones that scale. Say the thank you out loud. Touch her shoulder when you walk past. Laugh at the joke you've heard 400 times. And finally, learn to accept a repair when it's offered, because half of a repair attempt is somebody reaching, and the other half is somebody letting them. A marriage doesn't survive because it's well matched. It survives because it's well mended. So let's come back to where we started. For 40 years, you had a marriage in a boom, and the job was quietly doing an enormous amount of work in that marriage. It manufactured the time apart. It supplied the news. It gave you both somewhere to be needed, and it made the evenings feel earned. And then it ended, all at once on a Friday, and what you're feeling in the months after isn't the marriage failing. It's the scaffolding coming down. Here's the thing about scaffolding, though. It was never the building. It just held the shape while the building stood on its own. And what you have now, for the first time since you were both very young, is the building itself, unpropped, in plain view. That is more fragile than what you had. It is also more truly yours. Give each other somewhere to go, so you both have somewhere to come back from. Keep the repairs ahead of the damage. And be patient with two people who are learning, at 65, how to be married in a way they've never actually tried before. If this was useful, there's another video on your screen right now that goes deeper into the psychology of a well-lived later life. And if you haven't already, subscribe so the next one finds you. Until then, go find your Tuesday.